A wooden box. Plain. Functional. Almost disappointing to look at. People sat inside it, expecting something to happen. Warmth, relief, a shift in the body. Then, years later, another image. A federal court order. Officials enforcing it. Devices dismantled. Books and papers destroyed under legal authority. That contrast is the entrance to this story. Because whatever you think about the claims, the reaction tells you the temperature of the era. In the early to mid-20th century, a controversial psychoanalyst named Wilhelm Reich built a reputation as a man who would not stay inside the polite boundaries of his field. He began in the world of psychology, but he kept pulling the thread until it led into something larger. The body. Sexual repression, political obedience, fear stored as habit. He was not the first person to suggest society shapes the individual. What made him unusual was how literal he was about it. For Reich, the social order did not only live in laws and institutions, it lived in breath, posture, tension, shame. He argued that repression is not only moral, it is physiological. That what people call character can be a long-term bodily adaptation to pressure. That a culture can train a population to clamp down internally, and then mistake that clamp for virtue. To understand why this became explosive, you have to understand the era he was moving through. This was a time of political paranoia and ideological sorting. A time when the fear of contamination was not just a medical idea. It was a social idea. In that climate, sex was never just sex. It was a symbolic trigger. The body was never just the body. It was a battlefield for identity, loyalty, and control. Public language often sounded calm. Protection, safety, the common good. But underneath that language, societies can run a quieter program. Purity, conformity, legibility. The desire to make human life easier to classify and easier to govern. And when a thinker makes the body central and links personal freedom to the nervous system itself, the argument is no longer academic. It becomes political, whether he intends it or not. Reich's early work focused on the relationship between emotional life and bodily tension. He believed people develop chronic muscular holding patterns that correspond to psychological defenses. He called this pattern character armor. The idea was simple and unsettling. A person does not only defend with thoughts, they defend with muscle. In his model, the armor shows up in predictable zones. The jaw that never releases. The throat that never fully opens. The chest that stays held. The diaphragm that stays braced. The belly that stays tight. The pelvis that stays disconnected. He believed you could learn to read a person's adaptations by watching what their body will not allow. In his view, this was not just about therapy. It was about the social world producing a predictable kind of person. A person who internalizes restraint. A person who experiences fear as normal. A person who confuses suppression with strength. You can disagree with his conclusions and still recognize the question he was asking. If a society can shape the body, then it can shape the citizen. And if that is true, then mass psychology is not only persuasion and propaganda. It is physiology repeated across millions of people. Later, Reich moved into territory that made him far more controversial. He proposed the existence of a life energy he called Orgone. Reich described Orgone as a universal, pervasive energy. Not a metaphor, not motivation. An actual substance-like force that, in his view, sat behind living vitality. He argued that Orgone was visible indirectly through its effects. In the way living organisms seem to charge and discharge. In the way excitation rises, peaks, and then resolves. One of his most provocative claims follows from that. He believed health meant the body could complete that full cycle without chronic blockage. He called this capacity orgastic potency, not as vulgar shock, as a model. A nervous system able to build excitation, tolerate it, and release it. In his system, chronic repression breaks the cycle. Energy builds, but cannot complete. It turns into tension, anxiety, symptoms, and rigid character. He believed this energy flowed in nature as well. In weather systems. In atmospheric phenomena. In the difference between what he considered alive environments and dead ones. In his writings, Orgone becomes a single concept trying to unify biology, emotion, and the sky itself. He also drew a sharp distinction between healthy and unhealthy forms of this energy. He claimed that when Orgone is blocked, stagnant, or distorted, it produces illness, psychological and physical. He called one distorted form deadly Orgone, which he associated with toxicity, stagnation, and breakdown. Reich also tried to justify these ideas with experiments that, to modern ears, sound almost like scientific folklore. He reported observing tiny vesicle-like formations under the microscope, emerging from decaying matter under certain conditions. He called them bions. He interpreted them as evidence of a more fundamental life process. Something that sat at the border between the non-living and the living. Again, you do not need to accept this as physics to understand the pull. This is the promise of forbidden knowledge in its purest form. A hidden variable behind health, mood, sexuality, and even the atmosphere. A single invisible thing that explains too much. That is exactly why it attracted followers. And exactly why it provoked alarm. And Reich did not keep this as a philosophical idea. He built something. The Orgone accumulator. A chamber made of alternating layers of materials designed to concentrate Orgone. A box you sit inside. People reported sensations, warmth, tingling, a feeling of release. Reich interpreted these effects through his theory. Now, here is what matters for the story. Once a theory becomes a device, the conflict changes shape. A device is not an idea floating in journals. A device can be shipped, sold, used, promised, and the public world responds differently to an object than to a hypothesis. A device triggers enforcement. A device triggers institutions. There is also another layer here, and it matters whether you think Orgone exists or not. A chamber changes attention. Enclosure narrows the field of sensation. Expectation amplifies perception. Ritual and repetition alter the way the body interprets what it feels. That does not prove Reich's theory, but it does explain why devices like this can become powerful symbols. They do not only function as machines, they function as meaning objects. A ring, a relic, a talisman, a medical device, a wellness protocol. Different language, similar mechanics. When people believe an object is charged with transformation, they do not enter it as neutral observers. They enter it already leaning forward. The nervous system responds to that lean. And Reich kept extending the system outward, not only into therapy, into culture. He believed there was a social phenomenon that appears whenever repression is challenged. He called it the emotional plague, a contagious hostility toward what threatens the group's internal clamp. In his view, it was not just disagreement. It was a defensive reaction that spreads, turning fear into moral aggression. Whether you accept that concept or not, it becomes relevant the moment his work meets authority. In the United States, Reich's work with the accumulator drew legal attention. The Food and Drug Administration pursued action that resulted in a federal injunction in the 1950s restricting interstate shipment of accumulators and related promotional materials. Reich did not respond in the way institutions prefer. This is one of the most important dynamics in the entire story. Institutions do not only respond to claims, they respond to posture. There is a ritual of compliance that systems expect. If you are challenged, you are expected to narrow your language. Concede something. Submit to the procedure. Play the part. Some people do this strategically. Some do it sincerely. Some do it simply to survive. Reich did not. Whether you interpret that as principled refusal, or stubbornness, or a mixture of both, the effect is the same. The conflict escalates. He was convicted of criminal contempt for violating the injunction and sentenced to prison. And then came the part that turned a legal story into a cultural symbol. The destruction. Orgone accumulators were destroyed, and large quantities of Orgone-related publications were destroyed under the authority of the court. That fact sits in the mind differently than a fine or a ban, because destroying objects and destroying texts is not only enforcement, it is theater, it is purification. A kind of official exorcism. This does not mean Reich was correct. it also does not mean the state was correct. It means the conflict passed a threshold where the goal was no longer debate. The goal became removal. Reich died in prison in 1957. That is the end of the biography in the simplest sense. But culturally, the story kept moving. Because when you destroy a symbol, you do not always erase it. Sometimes you charge it. This is where modern patterns start to appear. When a device, a taboo subject, and a persecuted story combine, you get a myth engine. Believers can turn suppression into proof. Skeptics can turn strangeness into dismissal. And both responses are emotionally satisfying. Belief can feel like initiation. Dismissal can feel like cleanliness. Both can become identities. Neither guarantees accuracy. What it guarantees is loyalty to a posture. So if you want to take something useful from the Reich story, it is not a command to believe in Orgone, and it is not a command to sneer at it. It is a lesson about the friction between private life and public control, about how sex and the body become political instruments in certain climates, about how institutions escalate when someone refuses their ritual language, and about how suppression is not a reliable compass for truth. Sometimes suppression targets harmful misinformation. Sometimes suppression targets social disruption. Sometimes it targets disobedience. Sometimes it targets a mixture of all three. You do not get certainty for free just because the story is dramatic. Now we bring it back to the place Reich would have recognized as real. Your body, not as a metaphor, as evidence. Do this quickly. Find one place you hold tension right now. Jaw, throat, belly. Pick one. Do not try to fix it. Just notice it. Ask one question. Did I choose this? Or did I learn it? From family, from culture, from fear, dressed up as normal. Now name the inner authority. Not a government, not a person. The internal voice that demands you be acceptable at all times. Name it quietly. One slow breath. Not to perform calmness, just to interrupt the automatic contract. If you can do that, you can watch a story like Reich's without being pulled into either easy reaction, devotion, or contempt. Both are too simple. Witness is harder. Witness is cleaner. We seal with 3 lines. Suppressed does not mean true. True does not mean allowed. Allowed does not mean harmless. If this stirred something you can't quite put back to sleep, that's your cue. Step into the next layer with my book, Mental Magic for the Modern Magician. Remaining sovereign in a world that wants your soul. It's written to help you cut invisible strings and start running the ritual yourself. Then grab the free ritual guide and watch the initiation playlist to go deeper. Links are waiting below. Until next time.